Honduras and Guatemala experienced unprecedented social revolutions last summer, dubbed by many the Central American Spring. In both countries, hundreds of thousands of protesters have called for removal of corrupt presidents, and, also in both cases, the movements were born on social media. In Honduras, the ongoing mass protests, known as the Indignados or Indignant movement, is the first time in Honduras' history when the middle class has taken to the streets. In neighboring Guatemala, the protests represented the first time in Guatemala's history when private university students joined public university students to denounce the government. While the Indignados protests continue in Honduras today to oust President Juan Orlando Hernández, in Guatemala, the protests largely died after President Otto Pérez Molina was removed from office in September 2015. However, in the aftermath of the massive anti-corruption protests in Guatemala, a new civil society organization called Justicia Ya emerged that demands justice in a country where impunity is the norm. My project analyzes the overarching mission and tactics of the Indignados movement in Honduras and the Justicia Ya movement in Guatemala. My aim is to dispel some myths about the alleged weaknesses of these social movements. The anti-leader, anti-celebrity ethic is a hallmark of net native movements. The Indignados and Justicia Ya movements certainly fit this model. Activists with whom I spoke in Honduras and Guatemala believe that they are advocating for a cause, not a figure, so there is no need for a face. What is more, activists agree that the movements will lose legitimacy with a clearly defined leader. This is because the public would assume that the self-proclaimed leader intends to run for office, which in turn makes the movement political. And once a movement becomes political, civil society is not interested in participating. But is it possible for leaderless movements to have an impact?
There are plenty of examples throughout history of leaderless movements being really successful. The most recent and high profile of which is the movement for Black Lives, where people have come together in a very grassroots way with a completely horizontal structure. It's a let a thousand flowers bloom approach to advocacy that has really pervaded the culture in a way that I think leadered organizations often struggle and often fail to do.
In addition to lacking leaders, the protests are also criticized because the movements offer very few specific policy proposals to reform government institutions. Rather, the movements merely advocate for the removal of corrupt politicians. According to critics, this solution is a superficial band-aid fix to deep systemic problems. While there is no denying that institutional reforms are necessary to eradicate corruption in Honduras and Guatemala, it is equally important to raise awareness on these topics to ensure that the issue is embedded in the national consciousness. Only then will elected officials take anti-corruption initiatives seriously.
As we see quote-unquote leaderless movements or movements with different kinds of leadership taking forms of public education, of political discourse, and recruiting people to take part in those movements in a way that places them almost as an equal with the people who are most significant or influential on it. That creates a different set of conditions that don't privilege outcomes that are about specific pieces of legislation or regulatory changes, but creates a change in mindset or public understanding. And we've seen that be successful in the Black Lives Matter movement and in some of the movements of the squares, also sometimes known as the Arab Spring.
Along with raising awareness, another goal of the Indignados and Justicia Ya movement is to provide forums where citizens with shared goals can connect. It is important to know who your comrades are. In fact, An activist with Justicia Ya told me that the greatest success of the protests last summer in Guatemala was not ousting the president. Rather, the greatest success was meeting motivated individuals like himself who also wanted to fight for a more just Guatemala.
So, to conclude, leaderless movements can be effective, and movements that lack concrete policy proposals can be impactful.
While it is too early to speculate what lasting impacts the Indignados and Justicia Ya movements will have in Honduras and Guatemala, there is reason to believe that corruption and impunity have met a formidable challenger: collective action by the people.